Hi, Christine. Hello, everyone.
Hi, Deval. It's so nice to see you.
Yes, I'm so excited to be here today for the launch of the Truth Be Told campaign. How are you feeling?
I'm so excited. There's so much happening. A lot of persons are traveling, and I'm so glad that we're able to do this campaign, being in the Caribbean, and launching it with everyone. We're so excited.
And I know a lot of our peers are headed to Dubai for COP28, and we are holding down the fort here in the region, keeping our eyes on climate and gender. So we're here today to launch the Truth Be Told campaign, a Caribbean call to action on climate and gender. And this campaign is meant to educate the public and stakeholders on the gender aspect of climate change. So, as our leaders convene in Dubai, we want to make sure that they keep gender on the agenda. So, we have launched this campaign called Truth Be Told to highlight the issues of gender and to advocate for gender just climate action in the Caribbean region. And the campaign has three main components: increasing public awareness of how gender and climate intersect. We also want to advocate for the implementation of strategies that support gender justice and climate justice. And of course, we want to create visibility for women led action that is already happening on the ground in the Caribbean. So we're launching today, and the campaign will span until January 2024.
Yes, incredible, because we have 2 months of really hard work, but exciting things to come by. And we hope persons are able to follow us and endorse the campaign as we go on. So the Truth Be Told campaign is made possible through our work. Both Derval and I serve as co-chair on the Gender Working Group as part of the Caribbean Climate Justice Alliance. And this is also the perfect opportunity to share that the Alliance has co-produced an agenda, the Alliance Caribbean Climate Justice and Resiliency Agenda, which outlines the priorities for action as we look ahead to COP28, as we mentioned. So we'll drop the link in the chat. We're also continuously grateful to our sponsors, Canary, and also the Open Society Foundation. And we also want to say a big, big thank you to our community co-sponsors who've already endorsed the campaign. And we know that many of you will also endorse it as we go on and as you listen to the conversation this afternoon. So now that you've heard a little bit about the campaign, a little bit about our sponsors, we'll transition to what you're all here for, our panel discussion this evening, our fireside chat. We're so excited with a lineup of speakers who will be able to share their perspective on gender and climate justice.
Hi, everyone. Hi. Welcome to the Fireside Chat. I am Doreen Duncan. I'm the founder of Island City Lab. We're an urban planning and design think tank. I'm based here in Kingston, Jamaica, really dedicated to confronting the most critical issues facing Caribbean islands. So without a doubt, climate change is at the top of that list. So I am so excited to be here and to moderate this discussion with this very diverse and exciting group of Caribbean women who are, tackling this issue from different angles. So I'm going to quickly go through their bios while they hop on screen and then jump into this discussion. So first, we have Dominique Williams. She is a youth climate activist from the Federation of St. Kitts and Nevis. She is the founder of Hibiscus Tea, which is a digital publication on Caribbean climate change. She's also a Caribbean Climate Justice Project ambassador and a Hay Campaign country coordinator for the Federation. She was also a part of Girls Care 2023 cohort, and her interests sit at the intersection of economic policy, climate justice, and sustainable development. And hopefully Dominique will be able to hop on shortly. Next, we have Simone Ganpat. Simone is a young climate change researcher and consultant. Her work specializes in social ecological systems in the Caribbean from a Black feminist ecological perspective. So over the past 3 years, Simone has worked mainly in the nonprofit industry to advance ecosystem well-being through a focus on human-environment relationships. Simone is the founder of Kyrie Initiatives in 2022 with a vision of providing accessible and relatable information about the intersection between social justice and environmental issues specific to the Caribbean region. To date, her initiative has partnered with over 15 different organizations across the region to cover intersectional environmental topics, and recently launched a flagship program to focus on experiential environmental education. So next, we have Ashante Russell. With over 4 years of experience, Ashante has been involved with multiple programs that support UN Sustainable Development Goals within the national, regional, and international communities, while simultaneously advocating for youth inclusion on all levels of climate action. Ashante has acted as the Bahamas delegate for Youth for Climate Summits and the ACE Hackathon, and has served as a national youth representative on the Bahamas delegation at COP27. Presently, she's a full-time student at the University of Bahamas and is serving as a youth climate ambassador for the Commonwealth of Bahamas, and is one of the 151 Max Tabiso Edkins climate ambassadors under the Global Youth Climate Network. Thank you, ladies, for joining. Super happy to be joining and to be in conversation with you all. So while Dominique joins, I want to kind of kick off the conversation with this first question. How would you describe the intersection of climate change and gender justice in the Caribbean? And I'd love to hear you kind of incorporate your experience, kind of your background, your academic and your professional background as you're answering that question. Dominique, if you're good to go, I'd love to kind of hear your perspective first. First question, how would you describe the intersection of climate change and gender justice in the Caribbean?
Oh, I feel like this might be the most loaded question, but I am very excited to give it my best shot. I would first like to admit that this intersection is one that I feel like is not visible enough, and I feel like my experience only shows that. So I would have been, involved in a lot of climate change related work and activism, and yet before this summer, I had never really considered much of the intersection between women, gender, and the climate. So I am very grateful to Christine and those at Girls Care who, brought this to the forefront. And so when anyone asks the question of climate change and the intersection with, gender justice, I think the first thing that comes to my mind is accessibility and climate justice, and how the climate crisis affects everyone, but it affects everyone unequally. And so when you look at the way that the climate crisis impacts people, it has a tendency of making those who are already marginalized even more marginalized. So when we think about the issues that already face women and gender minorities, it only makes sense that, if you continue to restrict rights and access through, limited resources due to climate change or through other, impacts of climate change that it tends to have economically, then it only makes sense that, women's access and rights will only continue to be limited. And then I is important to think about when we think about, women and the intersection with climate change is also the intersecting identities that is involved in womanhood. So for example, being a woman in the Caribbean is different from being a woman in Europe. And so I think, when you think about gender justice and climate change, it's also important to think about the different intersectionalities that comes with, womanhood. Womanhood looks different for persons of lower socioeconomic backgrounds and those with higher socioeconomic backgrounds, different, races, and then especially being in the Caribbean, where we think about, the different intersecting, identities that we experience as Caribbean women. Again, climate change then can present to be an existential crisis when you consider all the things that already affect us and how they're being magnified by the injustice of the climate crisis.
Yeah, I think that's such a beautiful and a concise sort of introduction to this intersection, right? You said something, the already marginalized can become even more marginalized. And then in the second thing that you mentioned was the intersections of womanhood, right? So it's not just you're a woman, it's a woman, and you may also be the primary person responsible for taking care of the home, but you may also have a job outside. You may also be a caregiver, right? So it's also looking at not just the gender perspective, but all of the intersections and how they're either amplified, they're made more difficult, or they're made worse, right? Simone, love to kind of hear from your perspective as a scientist, ecologist. I'd love to hear from your perspective how you think about those two things being interrelated.
Yeah, great. Just want to say thanks for having me. Also to Christine and Zival and the team, thanks for embarking on such an important initiative, and also bringing people together, who are just interested in it, people who are experts, and also including young people. Well, all of us are young people, but it's really great to see Dominique here. I think Dominique might be the youngest of us, and I'm really, really happy about this inclusivity. So really setting the example here. To answer the question, to describe the intersection between gender and climate justice, I would go back to the meaning of climate justice, which, as Dominique said, it acknowledges that communities are differently affected by climate change, right? And I think one way to answer that is kind of asking, okay, how well understood is climate and gender justice by the people involved in the achievement of that justice? I mean, that's one very clear pathway to me to achieving this justice, whatever it may look like. How is it understood by these people involved in it? And the people involved in it, namely, are the people who are those who are harmed, those who are doing the harm, and those who seek to benefit or are affected by the harm done. And we speak about gender, those who are being harmed are basically anyone who is not a cisgender heteronormative person, right? In the Caribbean, I have realized that we tend to relate to gender in a way that is either woman or man. We all know that gender is a social construct as opposed to sex. But we are just beginning to acknowledge that gender is just not only about women. There's many genders. There's no gender, right? And so we really have to expand that definition a little more, right? And just to talk about these three actors, those who are being harmed. There is a strong history of activism in the Caribbean by women for women's rights. And historically, I could speak to Trinidad and Tobago. Historically, women were on the forefront of the labor movement in Trinidad. And when we talk about just touching on the ecological side, the natural resources side, in the Caribbean, it is known. Studies have shown, historical and contemporary studies have shown, that women make up the majority of the population that depend more heavily on natural resources for their livelihood, right? Livelihood, but also their lives, right? And that is something that is critical when we're looking at how well is this understood by the people involved in the achievement of justice. And we see that playing out when we look at the emergence of civil society organizations and activists that represent women in these intersecting fields. So, for example, the network of rural woman producers and so on, right? And that simply evidences the assertion of women in demanding that their rights be met, right? And there's also studies that clearly point out the intersection of gender and climate change in the Caribbean, but contemporary studies are mostly in agricultural contexts. Does this mean that there are no intersections that relates to gender and biodiversity, gender and land use, and so on? No, it doesn't, right? But we need to understand, and that's the role of the scientist. I am a natural scientist. I'm not a social scientist, but I have done work within intersecting spheres, right? The second actor, if if I have time to go on, those doing the harm, right? So, thanks. Those doing the harm. So, it is well understood that we exist in a state of neocolonialism in many, many parts of the world, and very much so in the Caribbean, right? The inequality, that is the gender inequality that exists, is structural, right? And how do we achieve justice? We take it to the courts, right? We take it. One of the ways, is taking it to the courts. We take it to the law, right? And when we talk about the people that doing harm and that structural aspect, do our decision makers and our policy makers understand the problem? It doesn't look so, and I'll say why. There is very, very little to no evidence of gender disaggregation in our Caribbean climate change policies, in our Caribbean natural resource management policies, in our tourism policies, in our agricultural policies, right? This is something that shows directly that the people who are making decisions do not understand or refuse to acknowledge the situation, what's happening, the inequality, right? And then those who seek to benefit or be affected by the harm done, and that's basically everybody else, right? This is my last point, but quickly, Dominic mentioned it, right? There are people who, depending on their socioeconomic situations, can get out of a situation, right? If there's a disaster, they are able to migrate. They are able to leave these climate risks. They are able to get out of those situations, and that is those people. They exist in a state of privilege, right? And they could either be allies or they could be part of the problem, right? And so we have to look at where do they lie? Do they understand the problem? Are we emphasizing the problem enough to them in a way that doesn't make them feel guilty, doesn't bring about shame, but helps them to understand that we are all in this together, and nobody will be free unless we are all free, Yeah. So that was my contribution. Just to end on one line, I would say we definitely do have a long way to go, but really understanding it from all aspects is quite important. And I think we have made some strides, and I am very hopeful for the future.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Simone. And I think something that you mentioned about those who are harmed, and you made the connection between the amount of kind of civil society groups that are formed by women, and that's something I didn't think about. But as I think about all of the sort of environmental or social justice organizations that I've come up across, especially here in Jamaica, they're all women-led, right? And we are here on a group, and several of us have kind of created initiatives, organizations, or projects, and we're women, right? So I do think that your point around those who are being harmed and trying to access power to create change and to create systems, right? And it kind of forces you as women to find alternative routes, right? We can't necessarily do it in policy, or it's difficult to do it in policy. So we're, applying pressure externally and through all of these other creative ways. But I wanted to head over to you, Ashante. From your perspective, someone who's still a student, someone who's interested in these things, who's doing advocacy and policy advocacy, how would you describe that intersection between climate change and gender justice?
Honestly, I describe it as it's still a working theory. And the reason I say that is because there's so much evidence in society to point to the needs and the necessities between the climate crisis and the issues we have with gender equality in our societies. This is something that we cannot, as was mentioned, the willful ignorance in that scope is blatant. Now, when considering the challenges, the reality of climate change is that most of our households within this Caribbean region are of a matriarch hierarchy. We have women running these households. We have women at the head. We have women that will be in charge of rectifying or in some cases seeking out preventative measures in the event that climate disasters arise. And we've seen that over the years. The reason why I say it's a working theory is because we know that there are chasms and gaps and holes that need to be filled, but they are still there. We're acknowledging, and that's another thing we do in this space, and we've done it for decades. We acknowledge the problem and we talk about the problem and we talk around the problem, but we're not as proactive to the issue. And that has created a cycle that we sometimes aren't even as cognitive of until push comes to shove and the worst possible scenarios occur. Now, I must say, though, over the years, we have began to put practice where practice is needed, and we've began to create programs and have dialogues such as this and conversations to actually get down to the necessary threads of this challenge. But there are certain things that need to be done in order to push the ballot a bit further. Policies need to be taken into account. Policy is the most proactive thing that we can strive for. And when considering the plethora of challenges to gender equality, whether that be gender-based violence as the result of climate crisis or climate related disasters, gender-based violence just as a general portfolio of a problem, there are so many things that need to be narrowed down and made more specific, because you can be as general and as generalized as you wish to be when talking about climate change and gender equality. But the reality is climate change is such a multifaceted portfolio that if you do not get as specific as needed, the intention may be good, but actually being proactive will be the challenge. So it's kind of getting us to the point now where we come out of the scope of conversation and we strive for more productivity. So definitely echoing the sentiments of my fellow colleagues on this call, a lot that has been said that I truly agree with and share.
Thank you, Ashante. Hopefully you're able to come back on, because I feel like you are preempting my next question. But before I go to the next question, I want to thank everyone for joining in and participating in the chat. Right. But I just want to echo something Ashante said, right? That the burden of homemaking falls on women. So if you think about the provision of food, that falls on women. The resilience of the home to natural disasters falls on women. Quality of life, right? All of these things happen at the scale of a home or a street or a neighborhood. And unfortunately or fortunately, women are the ones who are taking that burden, right? So everyone in the chat, please start adding questions and comments. But I want to kind of jump to the second question that Ashante kind of preempted, which is about policy, right? What are some of the key policy actions you'd like to see implemented to really support gender justice in the Caribbean? Let's start with you first, Simone.
Sure, yeah. So first of all, we need to start enforcing our policy. We'll get nowhere if we don't implement. And I can speak for my country, we don't implement. We recently launched a draft just transition policy. Our Ministry of Plan and Development was so excited and happy. And we're like, we're the first Caribbean country to launch this, etc., etc. And where was the consultation? I don't know. But we have this record, and I think it's a regional record of coming up with these policies, albeit very much in accordance with international environmental law and multilateral environmental agreements, which we in the Caribbean are very much active and ratified in many of those multilateral agreements. So we have an obligation to sign on to these laws, but we do not have the implementation. And we also do not have checks in place to make sure that our policy is implemented. So that's one point. We need to start with the implementation, right? We could have as much policies written up and hopes for action, but it wouldn't do anything if we don't have implementation. Secondly, we need to specifically include women and gender diverse people in the planning and development and implementation of the policies. There is not enough of it. And that is clear as someone who has attended national consultations. It needs to be a priority, right? On that note, we also, in order to inform policy, we need to collect data, right? And data is only useful in this case if it is gender disaggregated. We need to know the differentiated impacts. So policy actions as a result need to have women and gender diverse people in the planning and implementation, and it also needs to be informed by the collection and proper assessment and utilization of gender disaggregated data. Yeah, and I would say that is my contribution. Want to also just underline again implementation. Like we need to work on it. It's really it's critical at this point. It always has been critical, and we are far behind where we should be.
Simone, don't we just love a policy? I resonate with that so much, because I feel like we have this sentence that, especially for people who also work in government, that we love a policy and we have so many policies just gathering dust, right? And it says two things. One, that the policy is not implementable, right? We have created this lofty policy and not thought about how to implement it. And to your second point about who is in the room when the policy is created, right? So we're creating policies and we're throwing gender and all of these terms in there, equity and equality and all of these stuff in there, but were any of those people in the room when it was written, right? And I think those two things kind of go hand in hand. Who is in the room creating it, and how is that related to the actual implementation? And as you say, enforcement, doing the actual thing that we were brainstorming so wonderfully about, right? Dominique, what are your kind of perspectives on, important policy or implementation of that policy that you'd like to see?
Well, firstly, I would just like to say that Simone covered a lot of what I personally have seen and a lot of things that I wanted to touch upon the moment I heard that question. The biggest thing I would probably say is data. We are living in such an ever more information-driven era, and the importance of data cannot be overemphasized. To me, you cannot begin to start talking about policy before you know what exactly that policy is supposed to target. And I believe that that might be one of the reasons why, implementation is seeing such a downfall, because, when you're enacting policies to affect certain persons, but you're not even really sure what they need. I mean, you might think a certain thing might be the solution, but unless you do that research, unless you collect that data, and unless, as Simone said, you analyze it properly, it's very hard for you to design policy that can affect something targeted unless you quantify that target. And so I believe that, especially as we're talking about, policies and actions, as Ashanti said, how do we move beyond these conversations to, the actual work that needs to be done? I think that investing in data collection needs to be, placed first and foremost. It needs to be done in the beginning, throughout planning, and, in the end, as a way for us to measure, how far are we getting towards our goals. Another thing I personally would like to add is I think that's something that perhaps hasn't been discussed as much is cooperation from the private sector. I think that climate change is a problem, that affects everyone, and especially as we're thinking about climate change and gender justice. Although women are so underrepresented in leadership, we are represented within the workforce, within these, different public and social organizations. And so I think, finding ways to include them more, especially in the policy and the consulting stages of policies, how do these policies gear specifically towards them, and towards their involvement and towards building on the work that is already being done at the grassroots level by these organizations. that is important to think about with policy. And then also, how can we encourage, private corporations to also pick up their, part of the bill in terms of making sure that they operate their businesses in a manner that is sustainable towards, the entire community, the same community that is patronizing them. And then also when we're thinking about, the private sector, how do we as consumers, leverage the power that we have on certain industries to kind of, shift the different ideals and goals of these businesses.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that, Dominique. And I just wanted to kind of give an example about the data collection piece, right? So I'm an urban planner, and lots of what, I focus on this year is things around transportation, right? And transportation is like one of the key sort of approaches to adaptation, right? And men and women or different gendered people use public transportation very different ways, right? Women tend to use public transportation much more. They tend to have less access to private cars, right? And they're taking shorter trips, but more trips, right? If you can think about a woman who has to take their child to daycare, has to, do grocery shopping, pick them back up, stop at the pharmacy. They're doing lots of different trips, right? So what does it mean for us to have that information documented by, a public agency or a government agency when we're talking about the price of bus, right? The price of bus tickets, right? And I think to your point, both of the points you made, data collection helps make policies actionable, right? And the other thing you had mentioned around like metrics and evaluation, right? Because I do think that we like to say, we're going to be resilient in 2030, but not have set measurable goals each 5-year period or 2-year period, right? So I think what we're kind of getting at is moving from the sort of academic approach to this to doing the kind of nuts and bolts and holding ourselves and our governments and our teams like accountable to actually being able to do it, right? So we have another question here kind of about your expectations for COP, but I kind of want to go back before we talk about that to talk about a little bit about your work, both Dominique and Simone, right? So both of you have different initiatives and work that you're doing. And I'm curious about like the formation of these projects that you all are working on and kind of how that serves your kind of perspectives around gender justice and climate justice. Dominique, do you want to go first?
Okay, I can go first. So yes, I am, one of the youngest members on this panel. And I would say that my experience in climate activism perhaps is a little bit more in the earlier stages of learning, where exactly is work needed. And I think one area that, has personally called for my attention is, what is the role of young people in climate justice and recognizing climate justice as being the important issue that it is. I feel like in terms of awareness, a lot of the, thoughts and narratives about climate change, especially in our region, is dominated by, larger media such as, the global north, people who experiences with climate change are much different from ours. So a lot of the different campaigns that I've been related to have been in terms of like education in primary schools to, learn about climate justice. I've also founded this digital publication called Hibiscus Tea, in which we endeavor to, discuss issues that are pertaining to, the Caribbean region in terms of different climate justice issues. And of course, gender justice and basically pursuing different intersections about what exactly does it mean to experience, climate change from the perspective of a Caribbean young person, in terms of inspecting these injustices.
Thank you, Dominique. Simone, over to you.
Yeah, thanks. So I actually have a bachelor's in environmental biology and a master's in conservation. So I'm a natural scientist. And when I started working, I first worked in nonprofits that were focused on biodiversity. And so I was there. I was like in roles such as like science officer, research officer, but most of the stuff I was doing was out in the field. And then at one point, half of it ended up becoming like stakeholder engagement with the communities that we were working with. And I realized like I am zooming in on these ecosystems and these organizations are also zooming in, but they have an obligation to, whether it's a funding obligation, to the target communities, and that was lacking. And then when I worked in nonprofits that were more grounded in social issues, but they had an environment component, it was also kind of imbalanced. So what became very, very interesting to me was kind of understanding how humans generally communities interact with their environment. And that's what ecology is, right? Ecology is the study of relationships within the environment and of organisms within the environment, and organisms can include humans. And ecology actually spans very widely: political ecology, human ecology, critical ecology, feminist ecology, so on, right? And so I call myself an ecologist. I'm very, very early in my career, but it's been showing up in different ways. And so last year, I founded Kyrie initiatives kind of as a way to provide this accessible information that was also relatable. I am very much steeped in academia. That's just because I've been to school more years than I've worked right now. And it's kind of just something I've practiced. And so I read a lot of scientific articles, and I was like, wow, every time I read an article, whether it be about environment or climate change in particular, I'm like, wow, people should know this. And how can this be more relatable? How can I help to connect the dots for anybody who it might make a difference to, who it might matter the most to? So that was kind of the genesis of Kyrie initiatives. And right now I am particularly focused on science communication, just starting out in it, but very much interested in what it can do, especially in terms of diplomacy and policy, and also stakeholder engagement, and improving that process and expanding on what it means to engage a stakeholder, and what being a stakeholder actually means.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And it's there. I feel like there's so much similarities, right? Hibiscus tea, which is a great name. I love it. And Kyrie initiative.
It's really nice. I love it.
It is. But I think something around communicating information to people in a way that's accessible, right? And I am here with you as Simone about being in school for way too long. But like, how do you take this very dense information, which is kind of meant to exclude people? How do you take that information in an attempt to democratize it and like invite more people into the space? Because it's not that, when we're making these policies, people are kicked out of the room. Sometimes that happens, yes, but oftentimes just the language you're using kicks people out of that space, right? So I know we're running up against time, and we have a last question here, and I'm also seeing people in the chat asking about COP28. But I'm curious, Simone first and then Dominique after, kind of what are your expectations from COP28? I think Nan Alexander in the chat is asking, maybe the short-term expectations or hopes you think might come out of it versus the more long-term structural things that might come out of COP28. Simone?
Okay, yeah. So COP. COP28. COP is a process that has always led to decisions that are only evidenced in the long term. I can't say I'm looking forward to a short-term expectation. COP is for decision makers to make decisions and then decide on a time frame for those decisions to be executed. What I can say based on COP27 last year is that one really key issue was the operationalization of the loss and damage fund. And that is something that is bound to come up in COP. I haven't been keeping too many tabs on COP, to be honest. I have always been very, very transparent about like doing what I can do, and that is on the ground. So COP is not really has not really been on my radar, but that is something that based on COP27, something that is has the real potential to be very effective. Now, the point that sticks out to me is when this fund is operationalized, where does the money go? Who does it go to? How is it channeled? How much is it? And those are the questions that have not been answered at the last one. And when we talk about the gender aspects, we also need to be asking those same questions, So that's definitely at the top of my head in terms of COP28. And I hope my one expectation is that next year it will be in a country that is not built on oil and gas.
Fingers crossed, right? And I'm here for your light skepticism, right? I think that's true, right? The actions, the things that we can control happen on a local level. And so we're going to continue doing what we can do on a local level. But yeah, loss and damage is an important and interesting thing, right? And how it's going to be operationalized, we shall see, right? And Dominique, what are your expectations slash hopes for what's coming out of COP28?
I guess, paradoxically enough, I started off in a very similar position where, finding out that it's in Dubai and then, learning that Coca-Cola is one of the largest sponsors for COP. It didn't really, I guess, allay any of the worries that COP it has become nothing but a talk shop. But then, I've had the opportunity to have conversations with some of the persons who are going and some of the people who have been there. One of them is someone who is very, steeped in experience at the UN from the Caribbean. And she was saying that, so I basically asked her, what do you see as the role of COP? How important is it? And something that I've heard from many experts is that, it's less about what actually happens there and, who is there and how do they talk with each other. So, for example, being small islands, I was under the impression that it's very hard for us to get our voices heard. Whereas, if you talk to any climate expert who goes to these conferences, they would tell you that, the small island developing states, we're the ones who run COP versus, other, I guess, large international conferences, that simply is not the case. And so, in these conversations, it seems like what we have to look forward to more than the commitments from larger countries, unfortunately, is the commitments and the collaboration that, small islands make with each other, realizing that we are the ones who unfortunately have been left to carry, the foot of a bill of, carbon emissions that we were not the cause of, has caused this, I guess, certain clarity and union when negotiating. That being said, when it comes to COP, a girl can dream. And so I guess for my wish list, it'd be similar to Simone in terms of, getting very firm and, material guidelines to how the loss and damage fund will be operated, hopefully in a manner that is equitable to the persons who is supposed to serve. Something else I'm looking forward to, hopefully, is accountability towards, some of the larger countries who, have fallen back, especially this year, in terms of commitments towards reducing greenhouse emissions, thinking about the US and the Willow Project and China, restarting coal production. I'm kind of curious to see, knowing that loss and damage is going to be at the forefront of these conversations, how are they supposed to, I guess, almost justify their positions when they are, talking from both sides of their mouth. So I guess these are kind of what I'm looking forward to seeing happen. Maybe they will, maybe they won't, but I will always remember that, last year I had completely given up hope on COP. And then on the last day, they announced, the loss and damage, even though it was, barely anything and just a piece of paper with very loose goals, I think, and so I can only hope that the momentum is kept up in this upcoming COP.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a perfect combination of like realism and skepticism, and I think that's kind of where we have to operate, right? COP28, hashtag a girl can dream, right? But I think your point around what actually matters outside of the event itself being the sort of regional collaboration or SIDS, wide collaboration that happens afterwards. I think that's really interesting. And I know that we are approaching time, but I guess my last question related to that is kind of your ambitions, your aspirations for kind of regional collaboration across the Caribbean as we work on tackling these issues. Kind of what do you see? Are you looking forward to as a Caribbean region that's of course fractured by all different political, colonial, economic different issues, but at the end of the day, we're affected very similarly when it comes to climate change. So Simone, last thought, and then Dominique afterwards.
Yeah, I'll be brief. I think you summed it up really nicely in terms of, yes, we as different Caribbean islands are affected differently, but also quite similarly. I would like to see our leaders really listen to the people. I feel sometimes I feel like we're shouting to a wall. Some days I feel really hopeful, but I think that in general we are becoming more and more cognizant of what is happening around us, the existential threat that many of us are facing, and the fact that it is faced differently by different people. And I think that we need to have agreement, not agreement, but cooperation. That's the word I was looking for. Cooperation at different levels. And then towards Caribbean cooperation. And I think that's something that I really, really look forward to. I want to see that for us. Like, I love my Caribbean. I am from Trinidad and Tobago, but I identify as a Caribbean daughter. And I really want to see that cooperation to achieve the things that we know need to happen for us to have livable futures for everyone. So I will end there.
Thank you, Simone. Dominique, last thoughts?
I have to say that I like this question, even though maybe I am about to betray myself and my naive optimism. So I had the opportunity to travel to Antigua over the summer and got to speak with many professionals in their Ministry of Environment, and then came home and spoke to some, experts in terms of, energy and environment here in St. Kitts. And I think, one of the things that most greatly concerns me is when thinking about climate injustice, the injustice of finance, which is why loss and damage is especially, exciting and appealing to me. And I think one of the things that, has given me hope in terms of regional collaboration is that I guess we've kind of been waking up to the fact that, nobody will care about this more than us, simply because no one will be affected as much as us as small islands. And so when it comes to finance, many of our regional financial bodies are sort of waking up and investing more into, green technology, green initiatives, and I guess renewable energy investment. And that's something personally that makes me excited when it comes to, regional collaboration and like collaboration between SIDS, that we, I guess, are lending a hand to each other.
Thank you so much. I mean, I think those are perfect ways to sort of end the conversation. Thank you all for participating, both Simone and Dominique. Unfortunately, Ashante dropped off. I'm sure she's here in spirit. So I'm going to hand it back over to Derval and Christine.
What an amazing discussion. Let's thank Doreen, Dominique, Simone, and Ashanti for such an insightful discussion about climate and gender justice here in the Caribbean. What are your thoughts, Christine?
I love this panel so much, and I am dreaming. Like you said, everyone said we can all dream, and dreaming means we have hope and we're inspired. And whatever happens at COP or not, we're here in the Caribbean, and we are waking up to this call. And I think I'm so inspired by everyone, and I just appreciate all the panelists and everything that they're doing.
Yes, and a big part of this is engagement, and I was so happy to see the representation in the chat, persons attending, persons from Trinidad, Barbados, Jamaica. I was really happy to see the Caribbean showing up because, as Dominique mentioned, no one is going to care about this as much as we are because we are directly affected. I think at the start, one of the important points that was made is, how well do we understand climate and gender justice, as the public, as decision makers, as policy makers. So, Christine, all of this could not be possible without partnership and collaboration and support.
Yes, definitely, Derval. And I also want to thank you for all the incredible work that you've been doing with the podcast. As I always say, you're centering Caribbean voices. We are always, homegrown. We're always about that homegrown solution and homegrown centering people in the Caribbean. So thank you so much as well for everything that you're doing. And I want to encourage everyone to follow the campaign. And we really want to take time out again to acknowledge and say a big thank you to our community co-sponsors who have already endorsed our campaign. And we know this is just the beginning, and there's plenty of time. This campaign runs until January 2024. So there's much time for you to endorse the campaign and to follow us and get involved as much as you can. We also want to take time out again to say a big thank you to Canary and Open Society Foundation. We know that we're only getting started, and as Derval outlined, the campaign goals. We're going to be on all social media platforms. There'll be several social media posts, videos, blog posts, highlighting people that are actually doing work at the intersections of gender and climate justice. We're asking people again to endorse the campaign. And as Dominique said, this topic can't be spoken of enough. We really want to encourage the masses and educate the masses of people to understand this issue. And as Ashanti noted, there is so much to unpack, and we really have to get down to the specifics. Simone spoke about the importance of data, and Derval also mentioned that we do have a pre-survey, and this is really significant for us because it's helping us to measure our impact with this campaign. We will have a closeout event very similar to this one come January, and we're hoping that we can have enough data that we'll be able to share with you and to be able to share with the public, because we know that we're doing this work. We have a conference, we have the campaign, but it's important that we take time out to measure our impact. We also know that currently we are observing 16 days of awareness on the elimination of violence against women, and climate change plays a major role in this conversation. So with that, I want to say, Doreen, thank you so much for your kind moderation and everything that you're doing to make our cities more inclusive with True Island City Labs and all our speakers. Please continue to follow their incredible work. They're working across the Caribbean, and we have to continue to encourage each other and stand by each other. Make sure to follow the Climate Conscious Podcast and the Breakfast Collective. We hope that you can continue to learn and unlearn and unpack these necessary topics with us. And we want to also wish our colleagues a safe flight and a peaceful flight. We know they will represent us well. And as we said, this work continues with and without COP, so our work continues. Thank you all so much for joining us this evening. This is really just the start, and we encourage you to take ownership and join us